Hi, everybody. Welcome to English Digest. I'm Stephanie.
I'm Tom.
Hey, it's our history unit, which is really one of my favorite units besides food and travel. I like those too. But history is always fun because you get to learn a little bit more about the world, especially the world before you were born. I find it fascinating. I love this period of time that we're talking about, which is the late 1800s, early 1900s, when a really very long railroad was built in Siberia called the Trans-Siberian Railway.
Indeed, so that's what we were talking about last time, and we talked about the history of the Trans-Siberian Railway, but of course when I hear about it, I usually hear it from friends who are telling us all about their wonderful trip they had on the Trans-Siberian Railway.
Oh, you know people who've been over there? Not me.
Yeah, I've known a couple people who have. It's quite a popular an item on your bucket list, I guess, for a lot of travelers to have ridden on the Trans-Siberian Railway.
Cool.
And so, yes, I'm sure lots of people here in Taiwan would enjoy doing that as well. So I think that will probably come up in today's lesson. But again, we're going to continue talking a little bit about the history of the Trans-Siberian Railway and how they made modifications to it and how they improved it and how it became the wonderful railway that we all know and love today. So let's get to it. Let's read through the entire contents of our lesson, and then we'll come back to discuss it.
While the Trans-Siberian Railway was essential to the development of modern Russia, it quickly became obvious that the system still had its shortcomings. In 1905, war broke out between Russia and Japan, and the railroad's daily capacity of 13 trains made it difficult to move troops and equipment fast enough. After being defeated, Russia feared that Japan would take over Manchuria and control the section of railway that ran through it. To negate this problem, the government made improvements to the railroad. Wooden tracks were changed out for metal ones to boost train speed and size. The Amur line was also constructed between Vladivostok and Chita to connect the railway continuously through Russian territory. Additionally, the Trans-Siberian line was expanded through the rest of Western Russia up to St. Petersburg, forming a complete connection between Europe and the Pacific Ocean. The Trans-Siberian Railway continued to play a vital role in economic and military affairs as the country underwent political revolution and became the Soviet Union. During World War II, the railroad transported military personnel and equipment to the European front and evacuated civilians away from the fighting. During the latter half of the 20th century, the Soviet Union continued to expand its railway network, constructing the Trans-Mongolian and Baikal-Amur main line, and allowing connection to Beijing through the Trans-Manchurian line. More than 100 years after its first train set out, the Trans-Siberian Railway remains a celebrated part of Russia's heritage and modern economy. If you wish to experience its epic cross-continental journey, you can book a ticket for this truly incredible experience, one made all the more profound by the great story behind the railroad itself.
Okay, let's get to it, everybody. Let's discuss the contents of today's lesson. Again, we are connecting continents via the Trans-Siberian Railway. We're connecting Europe and Asia in this particular case. And let's continue to talk about it. While the Trans-Siberian Railway was essential to the development of modern Russia, it quickly became obvious that the system still had its shortcomings. So it was a great achievement. Everybody was astonished at the speed in which this thing was constructed. But still, it's like a work in progress. They built it. They had the first version, of course. And what happens, as you know, things change change over time. New technologies come out, and there are new national realities and stuff like that. So, yes, quickly in Russia, it became obvious to everybody. It became very clear that the system still had some flaws. It still had its shortcomings. And here we have the word shortcoming, most often used in the plural here. You could talk about people having certain shortcomings in their personalities or in their lives or whatever. This is something that everybody loves to talk about. Hey, what about Joe? He's got all these problems. He should really face himself. He's got all these flaws. He's got all these shortcomings that we don't have.
Yeah, we use it to talk about flaws in a person's character. Maybe someone has a really bad temper, or they're impatient, or they're dishonest. Those are shortcomings. But as Tom said, we typically use this in the plural form. So it's a fault or some sort of failure. It could be used to talk about a plan that has been devised or come up with at a company. And, when you look at it closely, it's got some shortcomings. It's got some flaws or problems. Or maybe you're talking about a system. You could use this word as well. But we do use it to talk about a person's character and the flaws they have in their character. So, yeah, it wasn't perfect, They built it before there was a lot of modern technology, so that's going to affect it long term. Well, in 1905, a war broke out between Russia and Japan. And the railroad's daily capacity, how many trains it could handle every day, was just 13. That's not very many trains. And it made it difficult for Russia to move troops and equipment fast enough from place to place. So on one side of Russia was Europe, and on the other, they were closer to Japan, and it just took too long. And they didn't have enough trains that they could move as many of the troops and equipment as they needed over there to fight those Japanese.
Yeah, most Russians live in the west of Russia there, and I'm guessing most of their factories and stuff are out there too. So, of course, they had to ship that stuff all the way across the country to fight the Japanese, and they could only do it with 13 trains a day, so that just wasn't sufficient here. And, of course, as a result, Russia probably was defeated, maybe not because of that only, but probably because of other reasons, because the Japanese are actually pretty rough fighting people, and they've got good tasting sushi and stuff like that. So, of course, the Japanese won. So, after being defeated, Russia feared that Japan would take over Manchuria and control the section of railway that ran through it. So, we did mention this a little bit last time. The Trans-Siberian Railway ran mostly through Russia, but part of it actually went through China there, through Manchuria there. And Russia was afraid that Japan was going to take over China, or at least parts of China. So, yeah, the Russians became very concerned about, hey, we need to build a section of the railway that does not go through Manchuria. It needs to go around it in Russian territory.
Yeah, so that was one of the problems. It says here to negate the problem, the government made improvements to the railroad. Now, you probably have seen very old-fashioned railroads. Those tracks that are on the ground were made out of wood and not metal as they are today, so they didn't last forever. Here, this word negate, do you see? To negate this problem or to negate the problem just means to make that problem go away or to counter that problem, to somehow find a solution to that problem. The government decided to make improvements to the railroad, which they needed to do. So those old-fashioned wooden tracks were replaced with some shiny metal ones that would last longer and could handle more trains on them without breaking, and it also helped the train's speed and size both. So those metal tracks or metal rails that they were put or that they laid on the ground made a big difference in how modern that train operated.
Yeah, I guess if you have metal tracks, the trains can go faster, and therefore they could send troops out to the Far East much faster than they could in the past. They could boost the train speed. So here, boost just means to increase the speed of the trains. You could also boost your production capacity or something like that by enlarging your factory or whatever. Boost just means to improve or to raise something higher. Give me a boost, for example. I can't reach the top shelf and get that book there. Give me a boost.
If you ever go to America and you go to a restaurant and you have a little child, maybe, from 2 to 5 years old, and they're too small to sit at the table, you can ask for a booster chair or a booster seat, and they'll bring something that lets that little one sit a little higher so they can reach the table, a booster seat or a booster chair. So yeah, those metal rails really did boost train speed and size.
Indeed. So I guess they could run larger trains on those tracks. Of course, trains or tracks rather have different gauges for different sizes. For like light rail systems, they have a different gauge than heavy rail systems. And so here they got metal rails, basically, metal tracks, and they could run larger trains on those rails. Now, the Amur line was also constructed between Vladivostok and Chita to connect the railway continuously through Russian territory. So, like I was saying before, a section of the railway went through Manchuria, which is part of China. Again, they were afraid that Japan was going to take over that section of China and control that portion of the railway. So, in this particular case, they made an improvement and built an extension line, I guess, that went through or at least between Vladivostok and Chita, and they could connect the railway continuously through Russian territory, no longer going through Manchuria and China. So good for them, and the railway then remained totally in Russian hands. And that brings us to the midway point in today's lesson. Let's take a break and listen to our Chinese teacher.
听众朋友大家好，我是安娜。我们今天要接续昨天的主题，带大家来一起看看西伯利亚铁路。因为我们昨天提到这个西伯利亚铁路啊，它这个在建设的时候非常的困难，但是12年之内就完成了9289公里，所以真的是非常厉害耶。但是呢，它这个西伯利亚铁路有一个问题，什么问题呢？我们来看一下第一段。这个问题就是当时在1905年的时候，因为俄罗斯跟日本之间爆发了战争，运输量不足，第一段出现了这个问题。好，我们先回过头来看一下第一段的第一句哦。第一句有一个 while 如果出现在英文的句首的时候啊，它有可能是 when 或者是 although 的意思。那你要判断就只能根据上下文这整句话的文意。所以在 while 之后，我们看到的是西伯利亚铁路对于俄罗斯的发展非常的 essential 很重要，但是很快的很明显的就发现有一个 shortcoming 它的缺点，所以在这里文意上的转折的 while 应该是 although 的意思，虽然很重要，但是逗点之后的 it 特别注意是虚主词哦，真主词在 obvious 后面 that 一直到句尾的地方。在第一段的第3句最后面的地方有出现一个关系子句，我们要注意一下。先行词是 the section of railway 那一段铁路，哪一段呢？ that 到句尾可以左右挂号起来， that 是关带， run through 后面的 ran through 就是穿越的意思。所以前面提到的是俄罗斯担心日本会 take over 接管满洲，然后 control 控制那一段铁路。那当然出现问题就一定要去解决它咯。所以第二段啊，为了要解决的这个问题，政府就想要改善铁路。我们看一下第二段第2句的地方，木头的铁轨 wooden tracks 要被改成金属的铁轨。如果同样句子当中已经出现过的单字，例如在这句当中的 track 铁轨，另外要再重新出现，但是被限定成其他种类的铁轨，我们就会用不特定的代名词叫做 one。 所以再看一次哦，木头铁轨 wooden tracks 要被改成 metal ones 金属的铁轨。 那么最后呢，我们在第3句当中看到，那么因为海参崴跟赤塔之间呢，那个政府还修了另外一段铁路，这样就可以串联整个穿越俄罗斯领土的铁路。
We're going to take a quick break. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Welcome back, guys. It's our history unit, and we're talking about the very famous Trans-Siberian Railway, which is famous for being the longest single railway line in the world. And it's sort of a cool thing to say. I guess you've ridden on this particular railway. So it might be on your list of things to do before you kick the bucket, which means you pass away. But it's not on my list, but it sounds like it would be a fun adventure for sure. It was built a long time ago. We're finding out, though, that when it was first built, even though it was quite impressive at the time, it still had some flaws or shortcomings. So we know that they eventually had to replace those wooden rails that they had initially laid down as track with metal ones so that the train size could increase and the speed could increase as well. They also discovered that they needed to build another little connective railway so that it didn't ever have to go through Manchuria. They were afraid that the Japanese would be in control of Manchuria. It's part of China now, so it's good that it just stays in Russia now, and you can just ride that train from one end of Russia to the next. So we're talking now about how they also expanded the rest of Western Russia. That line would go up to St. Petersburg, which is a very famous city, and it formed a complete connection then between Europe and the Pacific Ocean. So this really was a long stretch of railway.
Yep, so they made extensions both in the east and the west, and so you could go all the way from St. Petersburg to Vladivostok. And I wonder how long that's going to take you, especially if you're going to stop at places along the way. Of course, there are lots of things you could check out en route there. You don't want to sit on the train there for all that time. So indeed, it's quite a long railway now. And in the next paragraph here, it says, the Trans-Siberian Railway continued to play a vital role in economic and military affairs as the country underwent political revolution and became the Soviet Union with the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. So indeed, if you're talking about Russian history, you know that the Tsars were killed off and then the communists took over, and the railway played an important part in that political change there. And it also played a vital role in economic changes as the country did go through some political revolution. So here we've got the word underwent, which is the past tense of the verb to undergo, which means something happens to you. I have a broken leg and I'm going to undergo surgery tomorrow to help get it better.
Yeah, we do use that a lot to talk about surgery, undergo a process or an operation, undergo political revolution. Woo, that's a big deal. Remember, they had to go through an awful revolution in their country where the communists won the war, and they ended up killing all of those czars and their families. They were put to death. And then they set up the Soviet Union, if you remember your history correctly. So during World War II, the railroad transported military personnel and equipment to the European front. Front here just means where the battle is taking place. They'll often talk about the front of the war front. And that's just where both sides are meeting to kill each other, which is horrible about war. And they used that train then to evacuate civilians away from the fighting. So if you're talking about personnel, you're talking about people who work for a particular country or company, or even here we're talking about the military. So these are soldiers, and also besides soldiers who are actually fighting, you've got a lot of people in the military who are in charge of supplies and medicine and, taking care of those soldiers. They're part of the personnel as well. And equipment. So they had to use these trains to transport a lot of things to the European front. And also, what were they doing? They were evacuating civilians. To evacuate means you leave an area that's quite dangerous or where you're at some risk and you want to get away from that place quickly, so you'll evacuate. Sometimes, I'm sure you've heard fire alarms here in Taiwan. Maybe you're just practicing your fire drills, but they'll ask you to evacuate the building. Yeah, and either go outside or maybe go to a different floor. Here they were evacuating civilians away from all the fighting. A civilian is just a normal person who isn't part of the military or the army. And typically they don't get involved with the fighting. They want to stay out of it. But sometimes civilians are killed in war too.
Indeed, unfortunately, that does happen. So they were sending military personnel to St. Petersburg to fight the Nazis there. And, of course, the people who lived in St. Petersburg had to be evacuated, so they were taken away, all via the Trans-Siberian Railway. And during the latter half of the 20th century, which would be, 1950 to 2000 there, the Soviet Union continued to expand its railway network, constructing the Trans-Mongolian and Baikal-Amur main line and allowing connection to Beijing through the Trans-Manchurian line. So yes, indeed, during the latter half of the 20th century, the USSR, the Soviet Union, expanded the railway network. They constructed some branch lines going across Mongolia, and then Baikal-Amur, that's another line they added. And then, of course, they thought it was important to get down to Beijing there, and so they constructed, or at least they were involved in this construction of the Trans-Manchurian line, so Chinese people could go into Russia and vice versa, and they became the best of friends.
So moving on to the final paragraph, guys, it says more than 100 years after its first train set out, the Trans-Siberian Railway remains a celebrated part of Russia's heritage and modern economy. Yeah, it really played a big role, didn't it? So they're back to being Russia. They're no longer the Soviet Union. And although they're not communists, they're trying to get their freedom back as we speak, I think. So if you're talking about a country's heritage, it's things that they value in their culture. So it's their history, the culture that accompanies that, things that make that country uniquely its own. Going through whatever experiences you do as a country, plus just, things that make a country its own. For example, here in Taiwan, I think part of Taiwan is just, some of our festivals are very Taiwanese. I love that. The food, your food's part of your heritage too. All of those things make up a country's heritage. People can have heritages too. Your family heritage would include your relatives, your ancestors, your traditions that you have built up over the years in your family. And if you wish, it says to experience its epic cross-continental journey. Remember, you're going across several continents. You can book a ticket for this truly incredible experience, made all the more profound by the great story behind the railroad itself. Yeah, it's quite a journey. What does profound mean, Tom?
Well, usually it means deep, okay? But profound means it's like deep in meaning or something. So it can be very significant in meaning or significant to you. Oh, what you said was very profound. It moved me deeply. I thought about it for a very long, long time. So indeed, this railway is open to anybody who wants to travel. Lots of Russians ride on this train, as well as lots of international tourists. And, of course, they all want the experience of riding on the Transcontinental Railway, or excuse me, the Trans-Siberian Railway. It's quite an experience. And it's not just going through big snow drifts all the time, okay? It's not just crossing a frozen wasteland, okay? Siberia has other things to offer there. I think like Lake Baikal is there and some other cities that you can stop off at. And you can meet wonderful people along the way. You can have parties on the train and, toast each other with vodka or whatever and play card games. It could be a great experience.
Yeah, I wanted to mention one of our vocabulary words here, guys, is epic. And if you're calling a journey epic, you're saying it's really grand, it's really large scale, it's pretty amazing. It's not just a one-day trip or a half-day trip up to the town next to the one you live in. This is a pretty amazing journey. It's epic. So we hope those of you listening out there that have a desire to go on this Trans-Siberian Railway, get a chance and get your own experience riding on this pretty amazing railway, really.
Indeed. Hopefully, we'll be able to do that pretty soon once the virus kind of goes away. Okay, that brings us to the end of our explanation for today. Here comes our Chinese teacher.
还有做了哪一些改善呢？那么因为还要提到别的 improvements， 所以在第4句第一个字一开始就给了一个转成词语 additionally。Additionally， 我们常看到的也有 besides。好，除此之外还有什么样的一种改善呢？西伯利亚铁路它还延伸到俄罗斯西部的其他地区，一直到圣彼得堡的地方。不过在这句话当中啊，因为有一个分词构句，我们来看一下。第一个动词我们看到的是被动 was expanded。expand 就是往四面八方扩张的意思。第二个动词是后面逗点之后的形成，本来应该用一个连接词 and formed 把动词连起来，不过在这里呢，让整个句子通顺，我们就把连接词省略，所以形成的 formed 就变成动词 ing。在第3段的第一句话当中要注意2个重点，第一个，在什么什么当中扮演重要的角色，英文蛮常用这个片语 play a vital role in something。第二呢，我们在句子当中看到一个连接词叫做 as 3个意思 when because 如同好像。根据上下文，如果后面表示的是时间，那么 as 这个连接词就是 when 的意思，所以其实 as 在英文的文章当中还蛮常出现的，那要根据上下文去推断它的意思哦。好，接着我们看到在第2次世界大战的时候啊，西伯利亚铁路整个又把军事人员设备运送到欧洲的战线前线 front， 而且把平民百姓呢从战事当中撤离，所以在西元20世纪的后面的下半叶的地方，我们来看一下，在这一段当中第3句所谓的下半叶就是后面的一半 the latter half。 latter 表示后面的，比较后面的，相对于 the former 指的是前半叶，所以20世纪的后半叶，苏联就继续扩展它的铁路网 network， 并且修建了蒙古支线啊、贝阿铁路啊。我们在这句话当中又看到了一个分词构句，第一个动词就是前面的 continue to do something， 第二个动词注意哦，逗点之后的 constructing 本来应该是 constructed， 那么第3个动词在后面也是 and 之后，本来应该是 allowed， 但是我们把第一个动词跟后面2个动词当中的 and 都删掉了，所以我们看到的是动词 ing constructing and allowing。那我们在 allowing 前面这个 and 呢，看到的是它把后面的2个分词做一个连结，所以这个很长的句子其实本来就是一个分词构句。西伯利亚铁路到现在已经运行100多年咯，如果有空的话，或许可以去坐看看，体验一下它的美。我是安娜，我们下次见咯。
That's it for today, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. Please join us again next time for another edition of our show. From all of us here at English Digest, I'm Tom.
I'm Stephanie.
Goodbye.
Bye.